Well, why don't we just proceed, if that's all right with everybody? And I mean, David, he was very excited about doing the double portion of Acharemot and Kedoshim, which is right in the middle of the Torah, right in the middle of the book of Leviticus. Indeed, the phrase that everybody knows in Hebrew, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself, is almost exactly in the middle of the Torah. If
Oh,
you were to unroll a Torah scroll and count all the columns, you'd be very, very close to being right in the middle for the love your neighbor as yourself, which is why when there's a little bit of a gaming debate among some of the rabbis, what's the most important phrase in the Torah or most important teaching, is that Hillel comes up with love your neighbor as yourself, because that's the center of everything. But he and I were going back and forth about doing the summary of those portions, because that's, for both of us, that was our bar mitzvah portion. So I know that he wanted to do that. So we'll just skip that, other than my just introducing or saying that in the middle of the book of Leviticus here, there's kind of a pause from all of the restrictions and limitations and obligations and requirements of the priests and the Levites, which is where in Latin or English they come up with Leviticus, because it's about the Levites. But right smack in the middle of that, there's like chapter 19, which kind of diverts our attention from the priestly duties and the Levitical duties onto the this is what you shall do, kadoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem, you shall be holy, for I the Lord your God am holy. And then there's a new listing of not exactly the same 10 commandments, but these are things that you shall do, about remembering that you were a slave in Egypt, and leaving a corner of the field, and things like that, that are ethical responsibilities for all the people, because this is an Am Kadosh, it's a holy people, and it's not just things that should be done by or for the priests and the Levites. Okay, so we'll next, whether it's next month, God willing, or whenever we can, I'll ask David to.
He's having trouble connecting. I just got an email.
Aha. Okay. Well, should I twiddle my thumbs or should I go on? maybe I'll start to go ahead, because I didn't get volunteers for other portions. So you're all forgiven. But so I'll start with the.
I was just holding back because
Yeah, I know, Gary. Thanks.
Thought maybe somebody else wants to do this.
It was a model that I was envisioning for the study, but that's okay. All right. So after the double portion, that hopefully David will be able to join us and tell us about and teach. The next portion is called Emor. Begins at chapter 21 of Leviticus. Emor is another of the commands, the imperatives that God says to Moses that he should tell or speak to or teach the children of Israel. The usual verb is vaidaber, and then we also see vayomer. I'm not going to go into why in the literary analysis why one as opposed to the other. But here is God speaks to Moses and tells him to speak to the children or say to the children of Israel. And the rabbis usually say that when the verb is to say rather than to speak, to say implies to give a lot more detail rather than just say, boom, say these words, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the portion known as Emor, there are four basic themes. The first is a listing of the rules, or some of the rules that will apply to Aaron and his sons when they're serving as priests. Some of those rules are then used as paradigms, I guess would be the best word. And the primary example of that is that the priests are not allowed to touch or come in contact with a dead body, a corpse, except in the case of certain immediate relatives. By doing so, of course, renders them impure. The sacrifices that they would offer would be defiled. And so the priests, especially among some of the other restrictions that we have seen before, the priests are now told that they cannot come into contact with a dead body or a corpse, except in the case of like honor your father and your mother, where that commandment overrides. And there's a list of the first degree relatives that would be in this, and so that's an example of a paradigm, as I said, that when the rabbis in the Shulchan Aruch and the Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch and the codes in the medieval times, when they give a list of for whom we are responsible for saying Kaddish, for example, for whom we officially have a mourning period, a Shiva or a Shloshim or a year that we're obligated to be mourning. According to some, that's you're familiar with cutting your clothes, or what we call a kriya ribbon or something to make a cut, tearing the clothes and render. For which relative are you obligated? Now, you always can do it for others, but which are you obligated to go into those mourning practices? And the rabbis of the Middle Ages developed that list based on the list that's given about the priests for whom they should defile, or that they would not be defiling themselves. Gary.
Didn't include wives, as I recall.
Does not include wives. You're right.
So,
but like I said, the important thing to remember, and this could get us off into a side conversation, especially when it comes to things about the role of women. But these are things that you do not, they're not obligatory. Okay, that there's nothing that says that you can't mourn for your spouse, for your wife, but you're not obliged to from a religious point of view. In that sense, I had a long argument with a colleague of mine back in Michigan when our teenage son died of cancer, of whether or not you go through, because he was my stepson, but whether or not you go through and participate in all of these mourning practices for a stepchild, for example, or for a father-in-law, and different things like that. So welcome, David.
Hello, sorry.
No,
Hear me all right?
we're glad that you're here. Let me just finish up with Emor, and then we'll backtrack and invite you with Achrei Mot and Kedoshim if you're ready.
Okay, I'm all set, but you need to give me a little bit to catch my breath and set up, and then I'll be able to.
Absolutely. Okay, so also in this listing in Emor, in the listing of obligations and rituals, specifically for the priests and for the Levites, they talk about not to shave your heads, not to trim the side locks that come here in front of your ears, which is where the Hasidim, the ultra Orthodox, develop that way. A priest, a member of the priestly class, a Cohen, cannot marry a divorcee. Now, here's where there's an interesting, subtle nuance in Jewish law, in halacha. So what happens if a priest, a Cohen, does marry a divorcee? All it means is that he, because there's only male in the priestly line, that means that he cannot function as a priest, as a Cohen. It does not mean that that marriage doesn't qualify as what we call a kiddushin, as a sanctified marriage, or what in the Catholic Church they would call a sacrament. Okay, it's still a valid marriage. It just means that, and it's a holy marriage. It just means that that he can no longer function as a priest, as a Cohen, nor would any children of that marriage, any sons, for example, be able to function as priests. Okay. Similarly, any again, male with any kind of diagnosed or demonstrated physical or mental impediment or disability be able to serve as a priest. They don't lose their classification as a Kohen, but they cannot serve as a priest. Okay, so that's section number 1. Section number 2, I said there are 4 simple sections. There are 4 sections and more. Section number 2 goes through the holiday, the festival calendar. They're called Moadim. Moadim comes from the Hebrew word an aid, which is testimony or witnessing, but they're specific sacred times that are assigned with dates. Now listed. Of course, the most important is Shabbat. It comes every 7th day. Then the cycle begins, because the calendar year, not the annual year, but the calendar year, or the ritual festival year, begins in what we would say April, begins with the spring month, which we've concluded, Nisan. So Passover is considered the first of the holidays in that cycle, the 14th day of Nisan. And then the first and the last day, according to the Torah, the first day and the 7th day are considered days of solemn assembly. They're like a Shabbat. No work shall be done, etc., etc. Of course, tradition has later on added an 8th day to some of the festivals, or even a 9th day when we get to Sukkot, and the 2nd day when we're talking about Rosh Hashanah, or if we're talking about Shavuot. So Passover, then 7 weeks later, on the 50th day, is Shavuot, which means weeks. So 7 weeks later, that's the spring harvest festival, and that's the first time that we encounter the specific commandment of, when you are harvesting, to leave the edges of the field, to leave the gleanings for the poor. Then the next festival or observance, commemoration in the Torah, is the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, which is the 7th month of the year. It's not called Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. It's called Yom Teruah, or Yom Zikaron. It's a day of sounding the horn, sounding the shofar. And again, as I said, traditional communities have added an extra day. Then on the 10th day of Tishrei is Yom Kippur, Yom HaKippurim, the day of self-denial, if you will, which later is interpreted as fasting. In the Torah and in Emor, Yom Kippur is known as a Shabbaton. It's the Sabbath of Sabbaths, literally, emphasizing the most important practices of Shabbat, with the exception of the one, which is the one that most of us focus on the most in our contemporary world, and that's Oneg Shabbat, and that's the joy of Shabbat. I don't think any of us would think of Yom Kippur as a day of Oneg, as a day of joy, although some of the Hasidic sects do that, and there are quite a few stories in the literature about that. 2 weeks exactly from Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of Sukkot, of the fall harvest festival. Sukkot meaning booths or tabernacles, and that lasts for, again, seven days. And then on the 8th day is a ceremony, Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of coming back into your home rather from living in the booth. And we do that, or in the hut, to remind ourselves that the children of Israel lived in booths temporarily when they were freed from Egypt. And the symbols of the etrog and the lulav and the palm branch and the willows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then the third section of Emor talks about a symbol with which we are also all familiar, and that's the Ner Tamid, usually translated as the eternal light. That's a mistranslation. It's more a continual light or a perpetual light or lamp that is to be lit on regular times. It's not that it's supposed to be lit all the time. It's that there are specific times perpetually throughout the day, throughout the month, throughout the year when the Ner Tamid should be there. It's more a light of constancy rather than there all the time. And there's also connected to that, connected to the ritual of lighting the candle or the menorah with special beaten olive oil. There's also a ceremony of a double portion of loaves that are, a portion of loaves, a certain number of loaves of bread that are brought for the priests, and a double portion on Shabbat, which is where some people get the tradition of having 2 loaves of Shabbat, 2 loaves of challah on Shabbat, even if we're not priests. And then the fourth is an incident that's described. We're not necessarily going to go into a lot of detail. It's a troubling episode that when the Saturday morning group gets to it, we'll spend a lot more time on it. Of Moses relates an incident of capital punishment towards a man who has an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father. And there's an argument with a full-fledged Israelite as opposed to a quote-unquote half Israelite, if you will, and whether or not the person, the one who has murdered the other, is subject to a death penalty. The answer is yes. And then there's this phrase with which we're familiar, but again is one that's always misunderstood, of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is in the Torah. There's no question that the meaning is the value of an eye for an eye, the value of a tooth for a tooth, the value of a life for a life, not immediate retribution. In that sense, the Torah teaches compensation and recognition of the value of a human being, rather than retribution to be another form of justice. And in other words, the statement of the punishment should fit the crime, in a sense. So okay, so that's my quick summary of Emor. And we're going to go backwards, or now, oh yeah, sure, Gail, go ahead.
I have a question. So many of these things pertain only to the priests, correct? Like the shaving of the sideburns or whatever.
Well, yes. When they're commanded, or like I said, they make a distinction between, and specifically because in this portion it says Moses says to the people rather than commands them. So the understanding is that these are being described as modeling. That if it's good for the priests, you should think of doing it that way also.
Oh,
not
okay.
Obligated to. But you might want to follow it.
Oh, okay, because I got the impression that it was only related to the priests. And then I was thinking, so why did the Orthodox, why do they all have to have payos?
Well, the ultra Orthodox, and some of them don't, and some of them,
Right.
they don't hold it against. It's not, they don't discriminate against any members of their own community who choose not to, or for one reason or another can't. They don't discriminate against them. It just is, this is something, like a level of kashrut, or a level of personal piety.
Gotcha.
There's the statement that should, back to that, the notion of whether the priest can still offer sacrifices if he has been in the presence of a dead body or a corpse. And the bottom line is that if that happens, the priest must make sure to go to a mikveh by sunset of the same day. So somebody says, well, do you have to wait until sunset, or can't you go right away because you want to be able to get back into the practice or offering sacrifices or whatever it is right away? Well, of course you can go right away, but the outer limits are you would do it before the other. So if you choose to do it sooner, you can, whatever. Okay. That. All right. So we're going to go backwards. We're now going to go from right to left. No, left to right. I don't know. We're going backwards. Okay. Mr. David, please.
Okay, thank you so much. And I wanted to thank you for resending so much, Rufan, the link for this morning. I've been trying for over half an hour to get on, and I didn't have the right link. But finally, you saved me from the torture, and I was able to get on. So
right.
No problem. Next time, send the email sooner.
Yeah. Okay, I am so sorry about that, but here I am.
So, and happy birthday in advance, David.
Thank you. Thank you. Just before I start on this extremely important two portions, Acharemot and Kadoshim, I wish to announce that 60 years ago, on the 28th of April, Rabbi Norman had his bar mitzvah, 60 years ago this year, and his portion was Acharemot Kadoshim. 60 years ago, on the 29th of April, David had his bar mitzvah, doing the same portion at the Shar Shemayim congregation. So this, preparing for this, brings back a lot of memories. And I'm wondering if somewhere in the portion, there is the punishment for getting a little bit frustrated when I have trouble connecting to a Zoom session. But I couldn't find anything. It does begin with, and the Lord spoke unto Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron. And the Lord said unto Moses, speak unto Aaron thy brother, that he come not at all times into the holy place within the veil, before the ark cover, which is upon the ark, that he is not. The unfortunate incident gives occasion for instructions as the time and manner in which the high priest might enter the holy place. The death of Aaron's sons was a solemn warning addressed to the high priest that any desecration, whether it be on the part of the high priest or an ordinary priest, or even me trying to get into a Zoom session, would be severely punished. And so I was able to avoid getting too upset about it, and then finally was able to connect. And it begins, the important thing about it, Acharemot, begins the ritual of Yom Kippur, which, as you all know, is the most important observance of the entire Jewish calendar. And it says, Aaron was to take the two goats to the entrance of the tabernacle and to place lots among them, one marked for the Lord and the other for Azazel. Aaron was to offer the goat, and so on and so on. He was to sprinkle some of the blood. In some ways, this is a continuation of the rather difficult discussion of sacrifices, but this goes a lot more detail, and it talks about Yom Kippur and then it talks about other things that happened. There are several readings that take place for each aliyah, and the first reading, which I've already said, begins the ritual of Yom Kippur. In the second reading, Aaron was then to apply some of the bull's blood and goat's blood to the altar and to cleanse and consecrate it. In the third reading, Aaron offers the fat of the sin offering, the person who set the goat, sometimes referred to in English as a scapegoat, free to wash his clothes and bathe in water. And the fourth reading begins what scholars call the holiness code. God prohibits the Israelites from slaughtering oxen, sheep, or goats meant for sacrifice. And the fifth reading, God is threatening a karet or excision for Israelites who slaughtered oxen, sheep, or goats meant for sacrifice without bringing them to the tabernacle as an offering. God also prohibits consuming blood. And the interesting thing is that in that particular time, the Israelites tended to be more vegetarians. They actually only ate meat under certain specific circumstances. And that was kind of interesting to read, especially now that there's so many of us who are vegetarians. I decided I was going to be a vegetarian. It lasted about 10 seconds. And Wendy put the kibosh on that. In the sixth reading, God prohibits any Israelite from uncovering the nakedness of any other member of the family. And in the seventh reading, God prohibits a man from lying with another man. And this is really controversial right now, because this is where the ancient Israelite ban on homosexuality takes place. There are a lot of us who do not agree with that, who do not follow that. And as we try to be as inclusive as possible as a synagogue, as a temple, we do have to study and question just the appropriateness. Maybe it was simply saying how they wanted the Israelites to behave at that time, and that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility, or a lot of flexibility, and how that is interpreted now. The great philosopher Philo taught that Moses originally, this is going back to the first reading, proclaimed the fast of Yom Kippur as a feast and named it the greatest of feasts, a Sabbath of Sabbath. For many reasons, there was temperance. Second is that they want everyone to devote their entire time to nothing else but prayers and supplication. And the third thing is that the fast occurs at the conclusion of the harvest, to teach the people not to rely solely on the food that they have accumulated as the cause of health or life, but on God, who rules the world and who nourished our ancestors in the desert for 40 years. And I will come back to that final thing at the very end of the presentation. This is also Kedoshim. We're also doing Kedoshim, and it's kind of interesting about that because we see here that we are doing a double portion in this particular week, Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. On some years, the leap year, and I believe 2022 will be considered a leap year during which Acharei Mot and Kedoshim will be done as separate portions. But this year, 2021, they're done together. This is not considered a leap year. I read that in the Pentateuch, the Kedoshim is right at the center of Leviticus. It is also at the center of the Torah, and in some ways, it is the most important portion of all, but all of the portions are the most important of all. And so God is instructing the Israelites in the first reading of that to revere their mothers and their fathers, to keep the Sabbath, and not to turn to idols, to end the sacrifice of to eat the sacrifice, of well-being in the first days, and to burn all of the leftovers on the third day, not to reap all the way to the edges of a field, but to leave some for the poor and the stranger. Not to steal, deceive, swear falsely, or defraud, or to pay laborers. It admonishes us to pay laborers for their wages promptly, not to insult the deaf or impede the blind. And this is very important today. We do not mock people who stutter. In the second reading, God continues the instructions in judging fairly to, and of course, the most important thing of all, the golden rule, to love others as one loves oneself. And the golden rule, if we have to do one thing that is common to Judaism and Christianity, it is that line, to judge others as one judges ourselves. And we can actually go all back to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he says that, judge not, lest you be judged. In the third reading, God continues the instructions, and not to eat anything with his blood, definitely not to practice divination or soothsaying. I think that God would have something to say to Shakespeare and Julius Caesar, beware the Ides of March, because that is definitely a no-no as far as this is concerned. And then in the fourth reading, we're not supposed to wrong strangers who reside in the land, but to love them as oneself. Again, it's so important and so beautifully put in the fifth reading. God is instructing Moses to instruct the Israelites then he goes ahead and he lists the penalties for these. And there are quite a number of penalties. And in the sixth reading, God is telling Moses to instruct the Israelites. So there are certain penalties. If you insulted your father or your mom or your mother, you'll be put to death. And I guess that means I have to be put to death, because in my youth, Dad and I had a lot of arguments. We had a lot of fights. The beauty of it is that we always made up. There was a ceremonial making up that Dad believed in. And so maybe I got avoided that. But if not, I would definitely have to be put to death. And I'm wondering if it would have
Or
to
get stoned, one or the other, I suppose.
Yeah, I have to be put to death either by stones, or if it could be done in a more modern way, simply with electrocution. Anyway, they also tell you here in Kedoshim, again, that we're not allowed to lie with a male as one does with a woman. And we're not to have carnal relations with our pets or any other beast. And this goes on a little bit. And the sixth reading goes on and talks about we're not allowed to uncover the nakedness of an ant or a man who marries his brother's wife and the brother's wife whom he married. And then finally, he enjoined the Israelites faithfully to observe all of God's laws, lest the promised land spew them out. And in the seventh reading, God made it clear that because the land's former inhabitants did all these things, that God dispossessed them. And God is telling the Israelites as hope and as warning that to be as holy as to God, for God is holy, and God has set the Israelites apart from the other peoples to be gods. And I have one more thing to say. Because I was late, I didn't get a chance to do the poetry. And so the poetry reading today will actually go back to my reading. It is from Solomon bin Gabriel's translation of Adon Olam, which I think is so beautiful and so much fun that I'd like to share it with you. Because in a way, it summarizes what I've been trying to say in a beautiful and fun sense. Lord of the world, he reigned alone, while yet the universe was not. When by his will all things were wrought, then first his sovereign name was known. And when the all shall cease to be, in dread lone splendor he shall reign. He was, he is, he shall remain in glorious eternity. For he is one no second shares, his nature or his loneliness. Unending and beginning with, all strength is his, all sway he bears. He is the living God to save, my rock while sorrows, toils endure, my banner and my stronghold, sure, the cup of life whene'er I crave. I place my soul within his palm, before I sleep as when I wake. And though my body I forsake, rest in the Lord in fearless calm. I do have one final comment on the Kedoshim. It is not from the actual portion, but from the Haftorah, which is actually my part of the portion on April the 29th, 1961. And it said something, one line, which is very interesting from Amos 9, chapter 9, verse 13. And it says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him that soweth seed, and the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. And I spent quite a bit of time wondering what they were trying to say, and all the hills would melt. And the interpretation that I come up with actually comes from my Geology 100 course in Nova Scotia back in 1968 and 69, because the hills will actually melt, but not overnight. Over the course of geological time, the mountains will gradually get eroded away by weathering, by earthquakes, by other processes, and they will eventually get lower and lower, become hills, and eventually to a plain over a very long period of time. And so that's how I would interpret verse 13, and all the hills shall melt. And on that basis, on that note, I'm going to end my presentation. God bless you all, and back to you, Rabbi Noah.
Thank you, David.
David.
Hearing the poetry, it occurred to me we didn't recite a blessing, so a little bit late. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Thank you, David.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay, so to continue now, the last two sidras, parshiot, portions of Leviticus is also this year a double portion, Bahar and Bechukotai. Bechukotai is the second shortest of the Torah portions in the entire canon, if you will. But so the two of them are frequently linked together, and thematically they run together also. There are three important points that I would mention with the first, with Bahar, and two with Bechukotai. The first is we are now given much more detail about an idea that had been presented earlier in the Torah, and that's the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, if you will, the seventh year. Number 7 obviously is a very important number and recognized time frame throughout the Torah, beginning with creation. So the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, is a year of rest for the field, and there's no sowing, there's no harvesting, there's no pruning on all of our land, and we can eat only what the land grows in the uncultivated areas, if you will. Yes, this may have been a time when, and W was talking about the vegetarianism, but this may have been a time when obviously they had to look towards the other sources of food, because there wasn't going to be a lot of the grain and the fruit, and there certainly wasn't going to be an awful lot of wine available to them at that time in the Shemitah year. So if that's every 7th year, when each person, each animal, and now the land as well, because the land belongs to God, is entitled to to a sabbatical and to a year of rest. Now, 7 times the seven Shemitah observances, if you will, leads us to the 50th year, the Jubilee year. In Hebrew, it's the Yovel. Comes out as Jubilee in English letters. It's ushered in by the sound of the shofar, and the priests all reciting the phrase while, and I was joking at services the other day about, while the Liberty Bell sounds, but proclaim ye liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. This is the source of that particular quote. The liberty here, the Hebrew word is dror. It does not necessarily mean freedom. In the sense that we in the American tradition have come to understand that word. Freedom or dror in the Torah meant release from obligation, release from debts, release from servitude, but it wasn't necessarily freedom the way that we totally included. And speaking to the teachers in the group, that is not this in Hebrew. This is not the phrase or not the word that they use for like vacation or recess from school. Okay, there are different terms for that. It's not drawer in the sense of release. Okay. And in the Jubilee year, all, no matter from which tribe, no matter from which level in the caste system, all can return to their native original land or their original holding. So all transfer of holdings, all debts or loans, everything is canceled. Now, this did not take effect in the wanderings in the desert. Okay, remember, we're now in the Midbar, the 4th of the 5 books of the Torah. I'm sorry, we will be soon. We're ending up Leviticus, but we're still in the wandering part of the desert. And these laws about release and the Shemitah year and the Jubilee year were to take place after the children of Israel had conquered the Promised Land. So this was obviously they didn't own property, they didn't have their own holdings yet until the conquest. And then there's a discussion of how and how to buy or sell or release loans that may have been established either right before or even during the Jubilee year, and how those were to be handled, because obviously commerce was still to take place, and individuals might need a loan to buy a house or to buy a tractor or whatever it might be. So there's a discussion, and of course it becomes much more amplified in the later rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, whatever. Then the third section of Bahar, also within this larger context, talks about how to treat and what who falls under this definition, but also what the privileges of a ger toshav. Now, this also has immediate and contemporary importance to all of us. We can't go into it now, but you can certainly start to think in your own minds. This is the resident alien. This is the immigrant, if you will. This is someone who chooses to live amongst the new community, amongst the Israelites, though he or she themselves are not Israelites. And how do we welcome them? Of course, we do welcome them. And what are their privileges as resident aliens, and what are their obligations towards the Israelites and towards the tribes? Do we treat them as indentured servants? Do we treat them as members of the extended family? and are they subject to the same kind of laws and limitations that exist? So it's an interesting section to be studied, especially in light of questions that we in our modern community have about immigrants and aliens, and I don't mean from outer space. I mean aliens to our land, if you will. Bechukotai then.
The Jewish
linked
space
to-
lasers.
I'm sorry. What did you say, David?
Or the Jewish space lasers.
Or the space, right? The Space Force, right? If then in Bechukotai, as those of us who were together on Friday night and Shabbat, we were talking about, begins with a long list of blessings and curses. Right? If you follow all my commandments, God says, this is what your rewards will be. If you do not follow all my commandments and you desert me, this is what the punishments will be. And there's a horrible, horrible list of punishments. There are Jeremiah in the Haftarah follows up with the same kind of thing, although he's now talking from experience of witnessing the destruction of Jerusalem and being part of the exile. But the important thing here in Bechukotai, and the list of punishments or curses is longer than the list of blessings, incidentally, but eventually, even if it meant exile, but eventually God will remember his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and eventually the Israelites, the chosen people, will be brought back to their land, and the covenant will be reestablished. Then the final thought in Bechukotai, which is the end of Leviticus, discusses laws and the parameters again of vows, of gifts, of payments, whether they're individual to individual or whether they're promises that are made through the priests to God, et cetera, et cetera. It's also the first indication that the priest can accept or assess whether an individual can afford the same type or the same quantity or even the same quality of sacrifice that someone else, that his neighbor might be bringing. It's the first indication that we have that there was a relative system by which, through the priest, an individual who could not offer the 7 perfect animals or doves without blemish or whatever it might be, but maybe this individual only had 2. And did he or she have to convince the priest, or was the priest given the flexibility and the authority to just accept what someone would be bringing as his sacrifice or her sacrifice in what we call, the phrase we'll encounter a little bit later, of Terumat Halev, of a heartfelt gift, rather than it falling under the specific definition of what has been described previously. So that would finish then the book of Leviticus, Chazak, Chazak, Benit Chazek, as we finish that book. And then we go into Bamidbar. Yes, Gail, please.
Unmute, Gail. You're still, there you go.
There you go.
I was reading something at the end of Leviticus in Friedman's commentary, and it really is such a good wrap for this whole book. If I could read it, it's relatively
Sure. Of
Okay.
course.
Leviticus, thus, is a design for an organized society of people who help one another, who do not intentionally injure one another, who respect one another's property and relationships, who regularly assemble to celebrate together, who acknowledge their errors and atone for them, who regard life in humans and in animals as sacred, who pursue purity in various forms, who respect law and who are utterly loyal to one God.
Nice.
Kind of a
That's
nice
very nice.
summary. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Oh, you got a thumbs up from Grace. Okay. That's good. Actually, Friedman got the thumbs up. All right. So, welcome to book number 4. And I'll give you one little Hebrew grammatical thing. If you are saying the name of the book in Hebrew, in English it's called Numbers, because it begins, as we'll see, it begins with a census. But if you're referring to it in Hebrew, if you were saying just the name of the book would be Bamidbar, in the wilderness. Okay? If, however, if you are saying not the name of the book, but if you're referring to the phrase and add Sinai or Negev or Tzin or Tzur or whatever, then it becomes Midbar. The vowel changes. Okay? So it's just something. Now you're all brilliant Hebrew grammaticians, and if you hear someone just say Bamidbar by itself, it's incorrect, because that would be in a wilderness. And we never talk about being in a wilderness. In the Israelite history, we're always in a particular wilderness. So it's either saying Bamidbar, in the wilderness, or Bamidbar Sinai, in a wilderness, which is Sinai. That's, now you're all, like I say, you're all grammatical experts. Okay. But Bamidbar, in the wilderness, if you will, continues the narrative that when we hit the pause button at the end of Exodus with the completion of the Mishkan, the completion of the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness, the sanctuary, depending on which translation you're looking at, the tabernacle, the altar, the holy place, the sanctuary, but the Hebrew is the Mishkan. And it was completed as of the end of Exodus. Then we had, as we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, the book of Leviticus, and now we come back as if nothing happened. Okay, like I said, we've released our hold button. We begin with a census that, and all males over the age of 20 are to be counted. They're to be counted specifically because the anticipation was that in the wilderness, and now in the wandering through the wilderness, they're going to be encountering enemy forces. And so Moses and Aaron and Joshua needed to know how many soldiers they had. So they count all the males over the age of 20, which leads up to, if you're interested, 603,550. Okay. They've obviously had a high birth rate since they left Egypt. The Levites are not included. And here, when they talk about the Levites not being included, they're also referring to the sons of Aaron and his sons, the priests. They're not included because they would not bear arms. They had other responsibilities, so they would not be out in the military ranks. Okay, there was a separate count of the Levites just because they wanted to know if they were going to have enough to maintain the sacrificial cult. And the Levites, interestingly enough, the males again, are counted as of the age of 1 month, not 20 years, but of only 1 month old. 1 month becomes a typical, and some of you may know this either from your own experience or as parents or as grandparents or whatever it might be, that 1 month marks, according to rabbinic tradition, not the Bible, they're picking up on this 1 month category, but 1 month is considered for a soul, an infant soul, to be a viable soul. Okay. And if a child dies before the age of 1 month, there's technically no mourning period. It's as if the child never lived. Now, obviously, this is in a time of great infant mortality, so the whole category was a little bit different in the way that they approached it. But they focused on 30 days to be counted or accounted as a viable soul, based on this statement that so if 30 days old was good enough for God to consider that individual as one who would be in the number of priests or Levites, then obviously that's a number that God wants us to use as a measuring point. Yes, Amy, please.
I have a question. If a young Jewish boy becomes a man at the age of 13,
Right.
why did the census not include them down to the age of 13 rather than the age of 20?
Good question.
Well, it's a good question. 13 is religious responsibility. It's adulthood as a religious, as a participation in the religious community as opposed to military.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the way that I mean, I'm not sure that we would agree with that kind of distinction, but that's what it is here. All right. Okay. Yes, David, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. I do have a question regarding the opening of the Midbar as a census of the 600,000 Israelis. Every year at the Seder, we quote from Chronicles, which talks about another census which King David ordered.
Right.
And that apparently that was not appropriate for some reason. And God sends a sword to hang over Jerusalem in punishment over that. I'm wondering if you could address that a little bit, Rabbi.
No. No. I'm sorry, I have to be a little time conscious, but no, that's and Chronicles and that part of the Tanakh is a little bit farther away, and there are all kinds of other issues that play into it historically, chronologically, if you will, for Chronicles. But we can address it another time, but I'm going to take a pass on it right now.
Okay, thank you. One thing I do want to add is that years ago, I did some considerable research on that line from Chronicles and found out that there was a comet with a very long sword-like tail over at around the time, around 900 or so BCE, which would have been almost consistent with the time of King David's reign, and which actually might be what the author of Chronicles was referring to.
Sure. The image must have had great impact on them and be very memorable. And if it's a story that's handed down one or two generations before it's actually written down. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Yeah, I wanted to say that.
Absolutely. Okay, so we now have the Levites, the male children of the Levites are counted as of 30 days old. And that totals 22,000 of them. And then there's also a distinction of males who are the firstborn. And they needed that because, again, for some reason, God has said in a number of occasions that the firstborn child of any species, the firstborn is mine, God says. For special distinction, special privilege, special obligation, responsibility, whatever it might be. And the curious thing here with the numbers is that we mentioned that there were 22,000 children or males up to 1 month old. Okay, all right. But it also then says there are 22,273 firstborn males. And what do you do about those extra 273? And so there's a ceremony that's developed to redeem those 273 back from the Levites. They already had enough in their quota for the Levites to serve in the Mishkan. So they developed a system by which the parents could redeem back those 273 firstborn males. They weren't needed in the sacrifices, so the family could buy them back for a price of 5 shekels, whatever that was worth at the time. And those infant sons were relieved of the obligation of becoming Levites, and that develops into a later ceremony some of you may be familiar with, of Pidyon Haben, of redeeming the firstborn. I was redeemed. I'm a firstborn son. I was redeemed back so that I didn't have to go into sacrificial service. Little did my parents and grandparents know at the time what I would wind up doing in my career. But anyway, okay, that's besides the point. All right. So the Levites, and obviously Aaron and his sons, had to prepare the Mishkan, the tabernacle, to be fully portable. Again, we have like 39 years of wandering in the desert at this point. And we don't have any indication of if it was a competition or if one was just acknowledged for one reason or another, but the sub-tribe of Kahat. Now, Kahat is one of the 3 sons of Levi. So it's a sub-tribe of the tribe of Levi, of the Levites. And the sub-tribe Kahat, they're designated as the ones that would be the actual, what's the truck? 3 men in a truck or something like that, Allied van lines, or, so the sub-tribe of Kahat are the ones who actually did the lifting and the carrying, whereas the others were responsible for the packing up and making sure that everything was done in a dignified and holy manner. The portion then Devarim, Bamidbar, gives almost like a map or an illustration of where in the squared off camp of where each tribe, where they encamped in relation to the Mishkan. Obviously, Moses, Aaron, and his sons, and then the 3 sub-tribes or sub-tribes of Levi were the 4 areas around closest in to the Mishkan, and then farther out the other 12 tribes, and they're divided out. Interestingly enough, and it must have had some military. They must have been more aware of where their enemies might be approaching from. But the largest tribes, which meant that the side, if you picture a square, that the side to the east was the side that had the largest number by far, some 30,000 more than the other three sides. So they obviously must have thought that there was more danger of coming from the east. It had nothing to do with Jews facing east or anything like that, or have a seat by the eastern wall. The commentators discuss that everything happens now in the narrative of the wandering through the desert, everything of the portability of the Mishkan, the challenges to Moses's authority, including even the challenge from Aaron and Miriam to Moses's authority. And then Moses, as we know, really gets burned out, like Ruth Ann was talking about it, with all the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The theme seems to be, and this is not Friedman, this is more Sadia Gaon and some of the more classical commentaries. This theme seems to be that the Mishkan, which is the tabernacle, or although including also the Ohel Moed, which is like what I call the headquarters tent or the tent of meeting. The Even though they are made by God's direction, they are made by the people, made by Israel. And so the Mishkan, as the center of the religious cult and religious community, now replaces Mount Sinai, which of course was made by God. So now we're talking about humans bringing to fore the holiness opportunity and the worship and the customs and the ceremonies and the rituals that are developed, again, with God's direction, but are developed based on a human endeavor rather than only responding to the words that come in the revelation at Mount Sinai. So there's the Mishkan, the tabernacle, there's the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, and that replaces the top of the mountain. In other words, when Moses or Aaron speak to the people to interpret or tell them what they're supposed to do, they usually are standing at the entrance of the tent of meeting. God spoke at the top of Mount Sinai, but only Moses could hear the words, right? But now in the human endeavor, Moses and Aaron stand at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Petach Ohel Moed is a frequent location phrase. And they speak to all the people. All the people see and hear and feel God's presence, the Shekhinah, as a pillar of cloud, a pillar of fire, of flame, or maybe even, as David was telling us, maybe even as a comment or a meteorite that's flying through. But they all hear and feel what's called Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, but that also then becomes interpreted or translated, if you will, in later literature as inspiration. Okay, the spirit of God, so that all the people are now participating. You might remember the phrase Kol asher amar Elohim na'aseh v'nishma. Everything that God says, we will heed and we will do. There's a quotation in the commentaries. With this, I'll conclude, from a fascinating story and book. Some of you may be familiar. Judah Halevi, who is called before one of the emperors to defend Judaism and to explain all these different questions and contradictions and whatever. And the book is called the Kuzari. And it's a very famous tome to read from. And what Judah Halevi talks about here in the shift from Mount Sinai to the Mishkan, that the people can take with them, as opposed to just a memory of Mount Sinai. Now they have something that they can specifically see, hear, touch, feel, and be part of. Judah Halevi says that the tabernacle, or the Mishkan, becomes the heart of the body of the people. The camp all around the Mishkan is the body and the limbs, but the Mishkan itself, which eventually in the temple in Jerusalem will be the Holy of Holies, but the tabernacle itself is the heart, and that you can't really have one without the other. You can't have a beating heart without the body that surrounds and protects it, and you can't have a body and all the limbs without the beating heart to give it its pulse and its life force. So that's the context in which we will begin the discussion now of the book of Numbers. Yes, sir, David.
I just wanted to end my comment with just a thought that one of the things that's really central in the Torah is discussions of the land of Canaan, which most of us have visited in our lives. And I just wanted to point out the favorable comparison between the land of Canaan and the Arizona desert. As I walk through the desert, looking at Wendy's plants and everything during the daytime, or looking from the desert to the stars at night, I'm always reminded of how close this is to the land of Canaan. And I just wanted to say that at the
And the
end.
contemporary land of Israel.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
You know, I mean, when Lynn and I came out here the first time, we immediately commented on that.
Yeah.
Because it was something from our experience. Okay. Any other questions? I thank you. Strong and mighty, but small group, right? Okay. Thanks for being with us.
Thank
And
you.
wishing
Thank you.
everyone well. If we don't see you for, let's see, Shabbat is Saturday morning
Yep.
this week, and then Sunday evening is Shavuot.
Right.
And then the following Tuesday morning, so a week from tomorrow, we'll have a shiur, we'll have a discussion about the 10 Commandments.
Sounds good.
Gail, please.
Rabbi, I just have a very quick question, and you can email me back or whatever. I noticed that you were talking or had mentioned in the shofar something about a trip to Israel in November.
Yes.
Details would be nice.
Oh, sure.
Itinerary.
Sure. There are 4 or 5 other Beth Shalom Temple families, couples
Yeah.
that are planning to go. Some
Well,
of us have already booked our airfares, our
Oh, really?
tickets.
I'd like to see the itinerary though.
Okay, and we have a beer out. I will send it to you. I'll send you what
Okay.
we got.
Okay,
Thanks, Gail.
good. Thank you.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank
See
you,
you.
everybody.
Shalom.